The ledger book felt heavy in Rebecca Everett's hands, though it weighed no more than a pound, as she stood in the dusty office of her ranch house in Florence, Arizona, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor. She had been running the Double E Ranch alone since her father's death 6 months ago, in the spring of 1883, and something had been nagging at her for weeks, a persistent whisper in the back of her mind that the numbers did not add up, that the cattle counts seemed wrong, that the money flowing through her hands disappeared faster than it should. Now, staring at the entries in her foreman's handwriting, comparing them to the bills of sale she had found tucked away in an old trunk, she felt the solid ground of her world crack beneath her feet. Marcus Donnelly had worked for her father for 8 years, had stood beside his grave with hat in hand and tears in his eyes, had promised Rebecca that he would help her keep the ranch running just as her father would have wanted. She had trusted him completely, had relied on him to manage the day-to-day operations while she learned the business side of ranching, had believed every word that came from his mouth about market prices and necessary expenses and the harsh realities of the cattle business. But these papers told a different story, one written in falsified numbers and pocketed profits, one that stretched back not months but years. Her hands trembled as she laid out the evidence across her father's old desk. Bills of sale showing cattle sold for $20 a head when Marcus had recorded only 15. Supply orders that he claimed cost $60 but actually cost 40. Dozens of transactions over the course of 3 years, maybe more, each one skimming a little off the top, each one bleeding her family's legacy dry while Marcus smiled and assured her that they were doing just fine. The total amount, as near as she could calculate, came to somewhere around $8,000, a fortune that should have been securing her future, but instead had vanished into her foreman's pockets. The worst part was not the money, though that hurt badly enough. The worst part was the betrayal, the way he had looked her in the eye day after day and lied, the way he had taken advantage of her grief and inexperience, the way he had stolen from her father even before the man was cold in the ground. Rebecca pressed her palms flat against the desk and forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to decide what she needed to do next. She could not let Marcus know that she had discovered his theft, not yet, not until she had a plan. The sound of horses approaching drew her to the window. She recognized Marcus's bay gelding immediately, but the second horse and rider were unfamiliar. The stranger sat tall in the saddle, wearing a dust-covered black hat and a faded blue shirt, leading a pack mule behind him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback, and even from a distance, Rebecca could see the strength in his shoulders and the weathered lines of a face that had seen plenty of sun and wind. Marcus dismounted and shook the stranger's hand, gesturing toward the bunkhouse, and Rebecca's mind began to turn. She had heard Marcus mention that morning that he was riding into town to see if any drifting cowboys were looking for work. They needed an extra hand for the upcoming cattle drive to the railhead in Casa Grande, a 3-day journey that would take most of their crew away from the ranch. Rebecca had agreed to the hire without much thought, trusting Marcus to find someone suitable, but now she wondered if she could turn this situation to her advantage. A new man would have no loyalty to Marcus, no reason to cover for him, and might be willing to help her if she played her cards right. She smoothed her dark hair back from her face and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door. At 23, she was still young enough to doubt herself, still learning to wear the mantle of authority that her father's death had thrust upon her shoulders. But she had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had been raised to believe that Everetts did not back down from a fight. She tucked the most damning evidence into a leather folder and locked it in the desk drawer, then stepped out onto the porch to meet the new hire. Marcus looked up as she approached, his weathered face breaking into the familiar smile that now made her stomach turn. He was in his mid-40s, solidly built, with graying hair and the kind of face that most people trusted instinctively. Rebecca had to fight to keep her expression neutral, to return his smile with one of her own, to act as though nothing had changed between them. "Miss Rebecca, this here is Zachary Quinn," Marcus said, gesturing to the stranger. "He has been working ranches up north, looking for steady work through the fall. I figured we could use him for the drive and see how he works out." Zachary removed his hat, revealing dark hair that needed a trim and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was younger than she had thought from a distance, probably not much past 30, with a lean, rangy build and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. When he met her gaze, she saw intelligence there and something else, a wariness that suggested he had learned not to take things at face value. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried the accent of someone who had been born further south, maybe Texas. "I appreciate the opportunity. I am a hard worker and I know cattle." "Where did you work before coming to Florence?" Rebecca asked, studying him carefully. "Last few years I was up in Prescott, working for the Triple Bar Ranch. Before that, I was down in Tucson, and before that, various places between here and San Antonio." He met her eyes steadily, not looking away. "I have been moving around since I was 18, learning the trade. I am good with horses, good with rope, and I do not cause trouble." Rebecca made a decision in that moment, one born partly of desperation and partly of instinct. There was something solid about Zachary Quinn, something that suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, no more and no less. If she was going to confront Marcus, she would need allies, and a man with no ties to her foreman might be exactly what she needed. "The pay is $30 a month plus board," she said. "You will bunk with the other hands and take your meals in the cookhouse. We have got a cattle drive leaving in 4 days, and I will be accompanying the crew to Casa Grande." Marcus's head snapped around. "Miss Rebecca, there is no need for you to make that trip. It is hot and dusty and we will be sleeping on the ground. You should stay here and manage things." "I am the owner of this ranch," Rebecca said calmly, though her heart was pounding. "And I intend to see how my cattle are being sold. I will be going on the drive, Marcus, and that is final." She saw something flicker in Marcus's eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Anger, perhaps, or worry. He recovered quickly, nodding with apparent good grace. "Of course, Miss Rebecca. If that is what you want, we will make sure you are comfortable." "I am not looking for comfort," she said sharply. "I am looking to learn my business. Mr. Quinn, you can stable your horse and mule in the barn and pick any open bunk. Supper is at 6. We start at dawn." She turned back to Marcus. "I need to go over the supply list with you before the day is out. Meet me in the office in an hour." She did not wait for his response, just turned and walked back to the house, feeling both men's eyes on her back. Her hands were shaking again by the time she reached the safety of the office, but she felt a fierce pride rising in her chest. She had just made the first move in a dangerous game, and there was no turning back now. Over the next hour, Rebecca carefully organized her evidence, making copies of the most important documents and hiding them in 3 different locations. If something happened to her, if Marcus realized what she knew and decided to do something desperate, she wanted to make sure the truth could still come out. The thought made her mouth go dry with fear, but she pushed it aside. She had to believe that she could handle this, that she was smart enough and strong enough to face down a man who had been stealing from her family for years. When Marcus knocked on the office door, she was ready for him. She had laid out the supply list for the cattle drive, along with several innocuous ledgers, and she gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her desk. He settled into it with the ease of long familiarity, and for just a moment, Rebecca felt a pang of doubt. This was the man who had taught her to ride when she was 10, who had carried her on his shoulders when she was small, who had worked beside her father through drought and flood and Indian troubles. Could she really be right about him? Then she remembered the numbers in the hidden ledgers, the careful trail of theft, and her resolve hardened. "I have been going over the accounts," she said, watching his face carefully. "And I am concerned about our cash reserves. We seem to be spending more than we should be bringing in." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression sympathetic. "It has been a hard few years, Miss Rebecca. The market prices have not been good, and we have had expenses your father might not have mentioned to you. Ranching is not an easy business." "I understand that," Rebecca said. "But I would like to start being more involved in the actual sales. When we get to Casa Grande, I want to be present for the negotiations with the buyers." "That is not really something a lady should concern herself with," Marcus said, and there was an edge to his voice now. "Those buyers can be rough men, and they do not take kindly to women trying to do business with them." "Then they will have to get used to it," Rebecca said firmly. "This is my ranch now, Marcus, and I intend to run it properly. If you find that difficult to accept, perhaps we need to reconsider your position here." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken challenge. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Rebecca saw his hands curl into fists on his knees before he deliberately relaxed them. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "I have given 8 years of my life to this ranch, Miss Rebecca. I was loyal to your father, and I have tried to be loyal to you. If you are questioning that loyalty, then maybe I should just move on." Rebecca's heart leaped at the possibility, but she forced herself to stay calm. If Marcus left now, before she had gathered all the evidence she needed, before she had figured out how to recover the stolen money, she might never get justice. "I am not questioning your loyalty," she said, softening her tone slightly. "I am just trying to learn the business. Surely you can understand that. My father would have wanted me to be informed about every aspect of the ranch." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Rebecca had the uncomfortable feeling that he was trying to read her mind to figure out how much she knew. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Of course. I apologize if I seemed defensive. It is just hard to adjust to the changes, that is all." They went over the supply list together, and Rebecca made careful notes, comparing prices to what she had found in her research. Several items were marked higher than they should be, and she made a mental note to check the actual invoices. When Marcus finally left, she felt exhausted, as though she had been wrestling with something much heavier than a conversation about flour and beans. That evening, as the hands gathered in the cookhouse for supper, Rebecca found herself drawn to the window, watching them through the glass. Zachary Quinn sat at the far end of the table, eating quietly while the other men talked and joked around him. He did not seem unfriendly, just reserved, and Rebecca wondered what his story was, what had brought him to Florence at exactly the moment she needed someone she could trust. After supper, she took a shawl and walked out to the corral, where several horses stood dozing in the evening cool. The Arizona summer was brutal during the day, but the nights could be pleasant, with a breeze that carried the scent of sage and creosote. She leaned against the fence rail and tried to organize her thoughts, tried to figure out her next move. "Evening, madam." Rebecca turned to find Zachary Quinn approaching, his hat in his hands. Up close, in the soft light of dusk, she could see the details she had missed earlier. A thin scar along his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his worn shirt. He stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for her to acknowledge him. "Mr. Quinn," she said, "I hope you found everything satisfactory in the bunkhouse." "More than satisfactory, madam. I appreciate the work." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I could not help but notice some tension between you and Mr. Donnelly earlier. If there is trouble on this ranch, I would rather know about it up front." Rebecca felt a sudden urge to trust this stranger, to pour out the whole story and ask for his help. But caution held her tongue. She barely knew him, after all, and for all she knew, he could be a friend of Marcus's, planted here to spy on her. "There is no trouble," she said carefully. "Just the usual adjustments that come when ownership changes hands." Zachary studied her with those gray eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he did not believe her. "I have worked for a lot of ranches, Miss Everett, and I have learned to recognize when something is not quite right. If you need help with something, I am willing to listen. No judgment, no gossip to the other hands." "Why would you offer that?" Rebecca asked. "You do not know me." "No, madam, I do not. But I do know what it is like to be in a difficult position with no one to turn to." He settled his hat back on his head. "My mother ran a boarding house after my father died, back in San Antonio. Her business partner was stealing from her, cooking the books and pocketing the profits. By the time she figured it out, she had lost almost everything. I was too young to help her then, barely 16, but I watched her fight to get back what was hers. It taught me to recognize when someone is in trouble." Rebecca felt her breath catch. The parallel was so exact that it seemed like fate or providence or simple dumb luck. She made a decision, one that could be either the smartest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. "Come to the office tomorrow morning early before the others are up. There is something I need to show you." Zachary nodded slowly. "I will be there, madam." He walked away into the gathering darkness, and Rebecca stood alone by the corral, feeling as though she had just stepped off a cliff and hoping desperately that there would be something to catch her fall. The next morning, just after dawn, Rebecca heard a quiet knock on the office door. She had been awake for hours, unable to sleep, going over and over her plans in her mind. When she opened the door, Zachary stood there, hat in hand, looking serious and alert despite the early hour. "Come in," she said, checking to make sure no one else was around, "and close the door." She had laid out all her evidence on the desk, organized into careful piles. Zachary approached slowly, his eyes scanning the documents, and she saw his expression shift from curiosity to understanding to anger as he began to grasp what he was looking at. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, picking up one of the falsified ledgers. "At least 3 years, maybe longer. I have not had time to trace it all back." Rebecca's voice was steady now, strengthened by the relief of finally sharing this burden. "Marcus Donnelly, my foreman, has been stealing from this ranch from my family for years. He falsified bills of sale, inflated supply costs, and pocketed the difference. The total comes to at least $8,000, possibly more." Zachary let out a low whistle. "That is a serious amount of money. Have you confronted him?" "No. I only discovered the theft 2 days ago, and I have been trying to figure out the best way to handle it. If I confront him directly, he could become violent, or he could simply ride away and I would never recover the money. If I go to the sheriff in Florence, it is Marcus's word against mine, and he has been a respected member of this community for years while I am just a young woman trying to run a ranch. She barely understands. So, what is your plan?" Zachary asked, and Rebecca appreciated that he did not question whether she had one. "I am going on the cattle drive to Casa Grande. I am going to watch every transaction, verify every sale, and document any discrepancies. If Marcus tries to skim money during the drive, I will have fresh evidence and witnesses. Once we return, I will confront him with everything I have found and demand that he return what he has stolen. If he refuses, I will go to the law with documented proof of recent theft." Zachary was quiet for a moment, studying the papers. "It is a good plan, but there are risks. If Marcus realizes what you are doing, things could get dangerous. A man who has stolen that much money is not going to give it up easily." "I know," Rebecca said. "That is why I am telling you. I need someone I can trust, someone who is not beholden to Marcus, someone who will back me up if things go badly. I'm not asking you to fight my battles for me, Mr. Quinn, but I am asking you to stand as a witness and to help me stay safe." Zachary met her eyes, and she saw respect there and something else, something that made her pulse quicken. "I will help you, Miss Everett. What your foreman did is wrong, and someone needs to stand up for what is right. Just tell me what you need me to do." Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost dizzying. "For now, just watch and listen. Pay attention to how Marcus handles things, what he says to the buyers, how the money changes hands. Take notes if you can do it discreetly, and if anything seems wrong, tell me right away." They spent the next hour going over the evidence in detail, and Rebecca found herself impressed by Zachary's quick mind and careful observations. He asked intelligent questions, caught details she had missed, and suggested ways to document the cattle drive sales that would stand up to legal scrutiny. By the time the sun had fully risen and they heard the other hands beginning to stir, Rebecca felt more confident than she had in days. Over the next 3 days, as the ranch prepared for the cattle drive, Rebecca watched Marcus carefully. He seemed nervous, more short-tempered than usual, and she caught him watching her several times with an expression she could not quite read. She made sure to act normal, to seek his advice on ranch matters, to give no sign that anything had changed. It was exhausting, maintaining that facade, but she knew it was necessary. Zachary integrated smoothly into the crew, earning the respect of the other hands with his skill and steady work. Rebecca noticed that he was observant without being obvious about it, helpful without being intrusive, and he seemed to have a natural authority that the men responded to. Several times she caught him watching Marcus as well, and she wondered what he saw, what conclusions he was drawing. The night before the drive was set to begin, Rebecca sat in her father's office, writing a letter to her aunt in Tucson. If something happened to her, if Marcus or someone else decided she was too much of a threat, she wanted someone to know the truth. She sealed the letter with wax and addressed it carefully, then placed it in her desk drawer with instructions written on the envelope to be opened if she did not return. She was just finishing when she heard shouting from outside. Rebecca hurried to the window and saw 2 of the hands arguing near the bunkhouse, their voices rising in anger. Before she could go out to intervene, she saw Zachary step between them, his hands raised in a calming gesture. She could not hear what he said, but whatever it was seemed to work. The 2 men stepped back, nodded reluctantly, and went their separate ways. Marcus emerged from the barn and said something to Zachary, who nodded and walked away. Rebecca saw her foreman stare after Zachary with a speculative expression, and her stomach clenched with worry. She did not want Marcus paying too much attention to the new hand, did not want him to suspect that Zachary was anything other than what he appeared to be. The cattle drive began just after dawn the next morning, with 200 head of cattle and 6 riders, including Rebecca, Marcus, and Zachary. The other hands were men who had worked for the Double E for years, loyal to the ranch if not specifically to Rebecca. She had dressed in practical riding clothes, with a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun, and a canteen of water strapped to her saddle. Her father's rifle hung in a scabbard on the side of her horse, a chestnut mare named Copper who had been her mount since she was 17. The journey to Casa Grande would take 3 days, following old trails through the desert landscape of southern Arizona. It was August, and the heat was brutal, but Rebecca had lived in this country all her life and knew how to handle it. She rode near the middle of the group, watching the cattle and the men with equal attention. Zachary had been assigned to ride point with one of the other hands, helping to guide the herd in the right direction. Marcus stayed near the back, ostensibly to push stragglers forward, but Rebecca noticed that he seemed to be avoiding her. That was fine with her. She used the time to observe, to think, to plan what she would say when they reached Casa Grande and met with the cattle buyers. The first day passed without incident. They covered about 15 miles, stopping in the afternoon to let the cattle rest and graze near a small creek. Rebecca helped set up camp, insisting on doing her share of the work despite Marcus's protests that it was not fitting for the ranch owner. The men seemed to appreciate her willingness to pull her weight, and she felt their respect growing, which was exactly what she needed. That evening, as they sat around the campfire eating beans and cornbread, one of the older hands, a man named Pete, started telling stories about Rebecca's father. She listened quietly, feeling the ache of grief that was still so fresh, but also feeling comforted by the memories. Her father had been a good man, a fair boss, and these men had genuinely cared about him. That made Marcus's betrayal even worse, knowing that he had stolen from someone who had trusted him completely. Zachary sat across the fire from her, and when their eyes met, she saw understanding there. He knew what she was feeling, the complex tangle of grief and anger and determination. It was strange how quickly she had come to rely on his presence, how much steadier she felt knowing he was there. After supper, Marcus assigned the watch shifts. Rebecca had not expected to be included, but he gave her the midnight to 2 in the morning shift, paired with Zachary. She was not sure if that was coincidence or if Marcus was testing something, but she accepted the assignment without comment. She tried to sleep for a few hours, wrapped in her bedroll under the stars, but rest came fitfully. When Zachary gently shook her shoulder at midnight, she was almost grateful for the excuse to give up the attempt. They walked together to where the herd was bedded down, the cattle dark shapes in the starlight. "Could not sleep?" Zachary asked quietly. "Too much on my mind," Rebecca admitted. They walked in silence for a moment, circling the herd slowly. "Do you ever wonder if you are doing the right thing? If maybe you should just let sleeping dogs lie all the time," Zachary said. "But then I remember that letting bad things happen just because they are easier to ignore is how good people lose everything. Your father built this ranch through hard work and honesty. You owe it to his memory to protect what he created. I just wish he were here to handle it himself," Rebecca said, and was mortified to feel tears burning in her eyes. "I miss him so much, Zachary. I do not know if I am strong enough to do this alone." "You are not alone," Zachary said firmly. "And for what it is worth, I think you are stronger than you realize. Not many people would have caught what Marcus was doing, and even fewer would have the courage to stand up to him." Rebecca wiped at her eyes impatiently. "I am sorry. You probably think I am a foolish, weak woman." "I think you are brave," Zachary said, and there was something in his voice that made Rebecca look up at him. In the starlight, his face was all shadows and angles, but his eyes were gentle. "I think you are one of the bravest people I have ever met." They stood there for a long moment, close enough that Rebecca could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. She was acutely aware of him, of the breadth of his shoulders and the strength in his hands, and the way he looked at her as though she were something precious. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, since anyone had made her feel like she was more than just the burden she had become to herself. "We should keep moving," she said finally, breaking the spell. "The cattle need checking." They finished their watch without incident, and when Rebecca finally crawled back into her bedroll, she found herself thinking not about Marcus and his thefts, but about the way Zachary's voice had sounded when he called her brave. The second day of the drive was harder than the first. The heat seemed to press down like a physical weight, and the cattle grew restless and difficult to manage. One of the steers broke away from the herd mid-morning, and Zachary went after it with his rope flying, catching it neatly and bringing it back before it could cause a stampede. Rebecca watched with admiration, impressed by his skill and the easy way he handled his horse. Marcus seemed increasingly on edge as they drew closer to Casa Grande. He snapped at the men over small mistakes, and Rebecca caught him going through the supply packs as though looking for something. She made sure to keep her documentation hidden in her saddlebags, secured with a small lock that her father had given her years ago. That afternoon, they stopped at a way station to refill their water supplies. The man who ran the station was an old-timer named Buck who had known Rebecca's father, and he greeted her warmly. While the hands were watering the cattle, Rebecca took the opportunity to ask Buck about recent cattle sales. "Prices have been decent this year," Buck said, leaning against the porch rail. "Better than last year, anyway. I hear the railroad is paying $18 to $22 a head for good stock, depending on weight and condition." Rebecca filed that information away carefully. According to Marcus's records, the last sale had brought only $15 a head. That was a significant discrepancy, one that supported her suspicions. As they prepared to leave the way station, one of the hands, a young man named Tommy, came running up with a worried expression. "Miss Rebecca, we are missing 3 head. I have counted twice and we are definitely short." Marcus cursed and began shouting orders, sending men off in different directions to search, but Zachary held up a hand. "Wait, let me check something." He rode back along the trail they had just traveled, studying the ground carefully. Rebecca followed, curious about what he was looking for. After about a quarter-mile, Zachary dismounted and knelt beside the trail, examining something in the dust. "Someone cut 3 head out of the herd deliberately," he said, pointing to tracks that led off toward a rocky outcropping. "See how these prints are deeper, faster. Someone was driving them hard, trying to get them away before we noticed." "Rustlers?" Rebecca asked, her hand going to the rifle at her saddle. "Maybe. Or maybe someone who wanted to make a little extra money on the side." Zachary's eyes met hers, and Rebecca understood immediately what he was suggesting. They followed the tracks to a small canyon, where they found the 3 missing steers penned in a makeshift corral of rope and brush. There was no sign of whoever had taken them, but the implications were clear. Someone on the drive was planning to come back later and collect these animals, selling them separately and pocketing the profit. "We should take them back," Rebecca said. "And we should not mention to Marcus how we found them. Just say they had wandered off." Zachary nodded agreement. They drove the 3 steers back to the herd, and when Marcus demanded to know where they had been found, Rebecca gave a vague answer about them getting spooked by a snake. She saw suspicion in Marcus's eyes, but he could not prove anything. That night, camped within a day's ride of Casa Grande, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus barely spoke during supper, and the other hands seemed to sense that something was wrong. Rebecca lay in her bedroll, staring up at the stars, and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. Tomorrow they would reach Casa Grande. Tomorrow she would see firsthand how Marcus conducted business. Tomorrow everything would come to a head. She must have dozed off eventually, because she woke to the sound of voices arguing in harsh whispers. Carefully, trying not to make noise, Rebecca sat up and looked around the camp. Marcus stood near the remuda, talking intently with one of the hands, a man named Jack who had always seemed more loyal to the foreman than to the ranch. Rebecca could not hear what they were saying, but the body language was clear. They were arguing about something, and Jack seemed angry. Then she heard her name, spoken quietly but distinctly. Jack said something about the girl and getting in the way, and Marcus's response was sharp and cutting. Rebecca's blood ran cold. She reached for her father's rifle, checking quietly to make sure it was loaded. A shadow moved beside her, and she nearly gasped before she recognized Zachary. He had positioned his bedroll near hers, she realized, close enough to provide protection without being obvious about it. He put a finger to his lips and gestured toward Marcus and Jack. He had heard it too. They watched as the conversation continued for several more minutes, then broke up with Jack stomping angrily back to his bedroll and Marcus disappearing into the darkness beyond the camp. Zachary leaned close to Rebecca, his breath warm against her ear. "We need to be very careful tomorrow. I think Marcus knows you suspect something, and he is getting desperate." Rebecca nodded, her heart pounding. She had known this would be dangerous, but hearing that whispered conversation had made it real in a way that all her planning had not. These men were not just thieves. They might be willing to hurt her to protect their scheme. She must have looked frightened because Zachary reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid and reassuring. "I will not let anything happen to you," he said quietly. "I promise." Rebecca held onto his hand like a lifeline, drawing strength from his presence. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They sat together in the darkness, hands clasped, until the danger seemed to pass and Marcus returned to camp. Even then, Zachary did not move away, staying close enough that Rebecca could feel protected. She lay back down, still holding his hand, and somehow managed to fall into a fitful sleep. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with Casa Grande visible in the distance as a smudge of buildings against the desert horizon. The hands moved with purpose, driving the cattle forward with renewed energy now that the journey was almost over. Rebecca rode beside Zachary, and they spoke little, both of them tense with anticipation of what was coming. They reached the stockyards on the outskirts of Casa Grande just after noon. The yards were busy with cattle from several ranches, all waiting to be inspected and sold to the railroad buyers. Marcus immediately rode ahead to find the buyer he usually dealt with, a man named Sullivan, leaving the hands to pen the cattle. Rebecca dismounted and walked with Zachary to where the sale negotiations would take place. She had dressed carefully that morning in her best riding clothes, with her hair pinned up neatly, wanting to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. Several men looked at her with curiosity or amusement, clearly surprised to see a woman at the stockyards, but she ignored them and focused on finding Marcus. He stood near the sale ring with a portly man in an expensive suit who must be Sullivan. They were talking in low voices, and Rebecca could see money changing hands, though the cattle had not even been inspected yet. Her jaw tightened. That was not how sales were supposed to work. The cattle should be weighed and graded first, with the price negotiated based on their condition and the current market rate. She walked up to the two men with Zachary at her side. "Mr. Sullivan, I presume? I am Rebecca Everett, owner of the Double E Ranch. I wanted to personally oversee the sale of my cattle." Sullivan looked startled, then annoyed. He glanced at Marcus, who had gone pale. "Miss Everett, your foreman and I have been doing business for years. There is no need for you to concern yourself with the details." "Nevertheless, I am concerned," Rebecca said firmly. "I would like to see my cattle weighed and graded before any price is set, and I would like a detailed bill of sale showing the final count and the price per head." "That is not how we usually do business," Sullivan said, his tone turning cold. "Your foreman and I have an understanding." "I am sure you do," Rebecca said. But that understanding is no longer valid. From now on, all sales from the Double E Ranch will be conducted in full transparency with proper documentation. If that is a problem for you, Mr. Sullivan, I will be happy to take my cattle to one of your competitors. Sullivan's face reddened, but before he could respond, another man approached. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and sharp eyes, and he wore a badge that identified him as a stock inspector. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. Rebecca made another quick decision. "Actually, sir, I would appreciate your assistance. I have reason to believe that previous sales of my cattle may have been conducted fraudulently, and I want to make sure that this sale is properly documented." Marcus took a step forward, his face darkening with anger. "Miss Everett, you do not know what you are talking about. You are making serious accusations that could damage my reputation. Then you should have no objection to having this sale properly inspected and documented," Rebecca said, meeting his eyes steadily. "Unless you have something to hide." The stock inspector looked between them, clearly sensing the tension. "I will be happy to oversee the sale, madam. Let's get these cattle counted and weighed, and we will make sure everything is done proper." What followed was several hours of meticulous work. Every cow was driven through a chute, weighed and graded. The stock inspector kept careful records, and Rebecca insisted on signing off on each page. Zachary stayed close by her side the entire time, a silent but solid presence that gave her courage. The final count showed 197 head of cattle, all in good condition. The inspector determined that they should fetch $20 a head based on current market rates, for a total of $3,940. Sullivan, clearly unhappy about the scrutiny, agreed to the price and counted out the money in front of the inspector. Rebecca accepted the payment and signed the bill of sale, then turned to Marcus. "According to your records from last year's drive, you sold 200 head for $15 each, for a total of $3,000. But we just sold 197 head for $20 each. Even accounting for the difference in numbers and market fluctuations, the discrepancy is significant." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "Market prices change, Miss Everett. You cannot base accusations on simple price variations." "You are right," Rebecca said. "Which is why I have been going through your records for the past 3 years. And I have found a pattern of sales that consistently show lower prices than the actual market rate, supply purchases that cost more than the invoices show, and missing cattle that were never properly accounted for. The total amount of theft comes to over $8,000, Marcus. $8,000 that you stole from my father and from me." The silence that followed was absolute. The hands had gathered around, drawn by the confrontation, and they stared at Marcus with shock and growing anger. Sullivan had backed away, clearly wanting nothing to do with this mess. The stock inspector's hand had moved to rest on the pistol at his hip. "You cannot prove any of that," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Actually, I can," Rebecca said. She pulled out the folder she had been carrying and handed it to the stock inspector. "I have copies of falsified ledgers, real invoices that show different prices than what Marcus recorded, and bills of sale that show higher cattle counts than what he reported. It is all documented, all traceable. Marcus Donnelly has been stealing from the Double E Ranch for at least 3 years, and I want him arrested." Marcus's face went from red to white. He looked around at the circle of faces, seeing no support, no escape. Then his hand dropped to the gun at his hip. "Do not," Zachary said quietly, and suddenly he was standing between Marcus and Rebecca, his own hand hovering over his weapon. "Think carefully about your next move, Donnelly. You are already looking at theft charges. Do not add assault or murder to the list." For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Rebecca could hear her heart pounding in her ears, could feel the weight of the money belt strapped around her waist, could see the desperate calculation in Marcus's eyes. Then, slowly, Marcus raised his hands away from his gun. "I want a lawyer," he said hoarsely. The stock inspector moved forward and disarmed Marcus, then gestured to one of the yard workers to fetch the local sheriff. As they waited, Rebecca felt her legs begin to shake with reaction. She had done it. She had actually done it. Marcus was going to face justice for what he had done. Zachary touched her elbow gently. "You did good," he said quietly. "Real good." The sheriff arrived, a weathered man in his 50s who listened to Rebecca's story and examined her evidence with careful attention. He agreed that there was enough to warrant holding Marcus for trial, and he took the foreman into custody along with Jack, who had apparently been involved in the cattle theft scheme. The other hands from the Double E watched in stunned silence as their foreman was led away in handcuffs. Rebecca organized payment for the men and arranged for them to drive the horses and supply wagon back to Florence, while she and Zachary stayed in Casa Grande to deal with the legal proceedings. She booked 2 rooms at a modest hotel and spent the evening going over her evidence with the sheriff and a local lawyer who agreed to help her press charges. It was late by the time she finally made it back to her hotel room. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her dusty traveling clothes, and let herself shake. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was draining away, leaving her exhausted and emotionally raw. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. Marcus had been a part of her life for so long, and knowing that he had betrayed her father so completely hurt in ways she had not anticipated. A soft knock on her door made her look up. "Come in," she called, thinking it might be the hotel manager. Instead, Zachary stepped into the room looking concerned. "I saw your light was still on. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Rebecca laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I honestly do not know if I am all right. I feel like I have been through a war." Zachary closed the door behind him, leaving it open a few inches for propriety's sake. He crossed the room and sat in the chair by the window, giving her space. "What you did today took incredible courage. Not many people would have had the strength to see it through." "I did not feel courageous," Rebecca admitted. "I felt terrified. When Marcus reached for his gun, I thought I was going to die." "But you did not back down," Zachary pointed out. "Even when you were scared, even when it would have been easier to just let him go, you stood your ground." "That is what real courage looks like, Rebecca." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her look up at him. In the lamplight, his face was gentle, and his eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. "I could not have done it without you," she said. "If you had not been there, I do not think I would have had the nerve." "You would have found it," Zachary said. "You are stronger than you know." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What are you going to do now, with the ranch, I mean?" Rebecca had been trying not to think about that. "I suppose I need to find a new foreman, someone I can trust, someone who knows cattle and can help me manage the place properly. It will not be easy, especially after this. Word will get around about what Marcus did, and people might think twice about working for a woman who just had her foreman arrested. Or they might respect you for standing up for what was right," Zachary suggested. "I know I do." Their eyes met, and Rebecca felt something shift in the air between them. It was a feeling she had been trying to ignore for days, a growing awareness of Zachary Quinn that had nothing to do with his help with Marcus, and everything to do with the way he looked at her, the gentleness of his voice, the strength in his hands. She stood up, suddenly restless, and walked to the window. Casa Grande spread out below, lights twinkling in the darkness. "I have been alone for so long," she said quietly. "Even before my father died, I felt alone. My mother died when I was young, and my father was so focused on the ranch that he did not have much time for anything else. I learned to be independent, to not need anyone. But these past few days, having you there, knowing I could rely on you, it has made me realize how lonely I have been." She heard Zachary stand up, heard his footsteps cross the room. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence. "You do not have to be alone anymore," he said softly, "if you do not want to be." Rebecca turned to face him, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with possibility. "What are you saying, Zachary?" "I am saying that I have grown to care for you, Rebecca. More than I probably should, given that I have only known you for a few days. But there is something about you, the way you face your challenges head on, the way you care about doing what is right even when it is hard. You make me want to be better, to be the kind of man who deserves to stand beside someone like you." He took a breath. "I know this might not be what you want to hear, and I understand if you need to focus on your ranch and your life, but I had to tell you how I feel." Rebecca's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had not expected this, had not let herself hope for it, but now that Zachary had spoken the words, she realized how much she wanted them to be true. "I care for you too," she said. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself that it was just gratitude or relief at having help. But it is more than that. When I look at you, I see someone I could trust with my life, with my future, someone I could love." The word hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Zachary reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," Rebecca whispered. His kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though he was afraid of scaring her. But Rebecca leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home. She had been kissed before, awkward fumbling attempts by ranch hands or town boys who saw her as a pretty face and a ticket to land ownership. But this was different. This was Zachary Quinn, who had stood beside her in the face of danger, who had believed in her strength, who looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said. "It is late and you need rest. But Rebecca, I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. If you will have me, I would like to stay at the Double E to help you rebuild what Marcus damaged, not as just a hired hand, but as your partner. In business and in life, if you want that." "I want that," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want that more than anything." Zachary kissed her once more, soft and sweet, then stepped back. "Get some sleep. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we will face it together." After he left, Rebecca lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling as though her entire world had been turned upside down in the best possible way. A week ago, she had been alone and terrified, discovering that the man she trusted had betrayed her. Now she had exposed the truth, brought Marcus to justice, and found something she had not even known she was looking for. Someone who saw her as an equal, who respected her strength, who made her feel like she could take on the world. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Rebecca gave her testimony to the sheriff and the local judge, presenting all her evidence of Marcus's theft. The case was strong enough that Marcus's lawyer advised him to make a deal. In exchange for returning what money he had left and pleading guilty to the theft charges, he would serve 5 years in prison, rather than the 10 to 15 he might have faced at trial. Marcus had managed to save about $3,000 of what he had stolen, hidden in various banks under false names. It was not the full $8,000, but it was enough to help stabilize the ranch's finances. The lawyer explained that recovering the rest would be difficult, as Marcus had spent much of it on gambling and other expenses over the years. Rebecca accepted the partial recovery as better than nothing and tried to feel satisfaction at the justice being served. On the day Marcus was sentenced, Rebecca sat in the courtroom and watched the man who had worked for her father, who had stolen from her family, be led away in chains. She felt no triumph, only a deep sadness for what had been lost. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. Zachary sat beside her throughout the proceedings, his presence a steady comfort. When it was over, they walked out of the courthouse together into the bright Arizona sunshine. "What now?" Zachary asked. "Now we go home," Rebecca said, "and we start rebuilding." The ride back to Florence took 2 days, and Rebecca used the time to think about the future. With $3,000 recovered and the ranch's expenses now properly tracked, she could hire new hands, invest in improvements, maybe even expand the herd. But more than that, she had something she had not had before Marcus's betrayal. She had clarity about what she wanted, both for the ranch and for her life. When they rode into the Double E that evening, the other hands came out to greet them, eager for news. Rebecca told them what had happened, explaining Marcus's arrest and conviction, and watched as the men processed the information. Some looked angry, others seemed relieved, but all of them appeared to respect her more for having faced the situation head-on. "I am going to need a new foreman," Rebecca announced. "Someone I can trust, someone who knows cattle and is willing to work hard to help this ranch succeed. I would like that person to be Zachary Quinn if he is willing to accept the position." Zachary looked startled, then pleased. "I would be honored, Miss Everett." The formality was for the benefit of the other hands, but Rebecca saw the warmth in his eyes and knew he understood what she was offering. A position, yes, but also a partnership, a future together. The men seemed satisfied with the choice, several of them stepping forward to shake Zachary's hand and welcome him to his new role. Over the following weeks, the Double E began to settle into a new rhythm. Zachary proved to be an excellent foreman, earning the respect of the hands through his fair leadership and hard work. He and Rebecca worked closely together to reorganize the ranch's operations, implementing new systems for tracking cattle and expenses that would make it much harder for anyone to steal in the future. They also continued to grow closer, though they were careful to maintain propriety in front of the hands. Rebecca would find excuses to work alongside Zachary during the day, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch of the ranch house and talk for hours about their dreams and plans. He told her about growing up in San Antonio, about watching his mother struggle after his father's death, about the years he had spent drifting from ranch to ranch looking for something he could not quite name. "I think I was looking for a place to belong," he said one night as they watched the stars come out over the desert. "Somewhere I could put down roots and build something lasting." "Have you found it?" Rebecca asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "I think I have," Zachary said, turning to look at her. "I have found it here with you." Rebecca's heart felt so full she thought it might overflow. "I am glad you came to Florence when you did. I do not know what I would have done without you." "You would have found a way," Zachary said confidently. "You always find a way, Rebecca. That is one of the things I love about you." It was the first time either of them had used the word love directly, and Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since that first night when you offered to help me, when you saw that I was in trouble and decided to stand beside me." Zachary reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I want to spend the rest of my life standing beside you. I want to help you build this ranch into something your father would be proud of, and I want to build a family with you if you will have me. Rebecca Everett, will you marry me?" Rebecca had known the question was coming, had felt it building between them for weeks, but hearing the actual words still took her breath away. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Zachary Quinn, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her there on the porch, under the vast Arizona sky, and Rebecca felt as though everything in her life had finally fallen into place. The grief of losing her father, the betrayal of discovering Marcus's theft, the fear and uncertainty of the past months, it all seemed to lead to this moment, to this man, to this future stretching out before them bright with possibility. They were married 6 weeks later, in a simple ceremony in Florence attended by the ranch hands and the townspeople who had known Rebecca's family. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk for years, and carried wildflowers picked from the desert. Zachary wore a new suit purchased specially for the occasion, and when he saw Rebecca walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the entire congregation erupted in cheers. They held a reception at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food prepared by every woman in the county who wanted to contribute. The hands played music on fiddles and guitars, and Rebecca danced with her new husband under the stars, feeling happier than she had ever thought possible. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom in the ranch house that now belonged to both of them, Zachary held Rebecca close and promised to love her and stand beside her for the rest of their lives. She believed him, trusted him with her whole heart in a way she had not thought she would ever be able to trust anyone again after Marcus's betrayal. The months that followed were busy, but rewarding. With Zachary as foreman and Rebecca managing the business side, the Double E began to thrive. They hired additional hands, purchased new breeding stock, and negotiated better deals with the railroads. The $3,000 recovered from Marcus went toward improvements that made the ranch more efficient and profitable. More importantly, Rebecca and Zachary built a life together. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, discovered how to work together as true partners, and fell more deeply in love with each passing day. Rebecca marveled at how natural it felt to have Zachary beside her, how right it seemed to share her thoughts and fears and dreams with him. He made her laugh, supported her when she doubted herself, and challenged her to be the best version of herself. The following spring, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had never thought much about having children, had been too focused on survival and on saving the ranch. But now, carrying Zachary's child, she felt a fierce protectiveness and a deep desire to build something lasting for their family. Zachary was over the moon when she told him. He immediately became overprotective, insisting she rest more and work less, though Rebecca refused to be treated like an invalid. They compromised, with Rebecca handling the office work and lighter chores while Zachary took on more of the physical labor. The hands teased them good-naturedly about the coming baby, and several of the town women came by to offer advice and assistance. Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Rebecca's father, and watching Zachary hold their son for the first time, Rebecca felt her heart overflow with love. This was what she had fought for, what she had risked everything to protect. Not just the ranch, but the ability to build a future, to create a family, to pass on her father's legacy to the next generation. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were droughts and difficult calving seasons, market fluctuations and equipment failures. But Rebecca and Zachary faced each obstacle together, drawing strength from their partnership and their love. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Sarah in 1886 and another son named James in 1888, and the ranch house that had once seemed so empty was now filled with laughter and noise. As their children grew, Rebecca told them stories about their grandfather, about the man who had built the double E from nothing and who had taught her to value hard work and integrity above all else. She also told them about Marcus Donnelly's betrayal, though she framed it as a lesson rather than a cautionary tale. Trust was precious, she explained, and had to be earned and maintained through honest dealing and consistent character. Marcus himself was released from prison in 1889, having served his 5-year sentence. Rebecca heard he had moved to California, trying to start fresh in a place where no one knew his history. She found she could think about him now without the burning anger she had felt before. He had stolen from her family, yes, but in doing so he had inadvertently given her something precious. The crisis had brought Zachary into her life, had forced her to discover her own strength, had taught her that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. By 1895, the Double E Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in southern Arizona. Rebecca and Zachary had expanded their holdings, purchased neighboring land, and built a reputation for honest dealing and quality cattle. Their children were growing up strong and capable, learning the ranching business from the ground up, and Rebecca often thought about how different things might have been if she had not found the courage to confront Marcus all those years ago. One evening, as Rebecca and Zachary sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, "Do you ever think about that first night you arrived here? When you rode up with Marcus and I was standing in the office, having just discovered what he had done?" "All the time," Zachary said, pulling her closer. "I think about how scared you must have been and how brave you were to trust me with the truth. I think about how easily things could have gone differently, how I could have just been another hand passing through, how we might never have found each other." "I do not believe that," Rebecca said. "I think we were meant to find each other, Zachary. I think everything that happened, even the bad things, was leading us to where we are now." "Maybe so," Zachary agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I got a letter from Pete yesterday. You remember, the hand who used to work for us back in the early days. He said he is retiring and wanted to know if we were hiring." "What did you tell him?" Rebecca asked. "I told him we always have room for good men who are honest and hardworking. I also told him that we run things differently here than most places, that the owner is not afraid to get her hands dirty, and the foreman used to be a drifting cowboy who got lucky enough to find a woman who believed in him." Rebecca laughed. "You did not say that." "I did," Zachary said, grinning. "I also told him that if he comes to work for us, he better be prepared to respect the boss, because Miss Rebecca Everett Quinn does not take any nonsense from anyone." "Mr. Zachary Quinn should remember that too," Rebecca said teasingly. "Oh, I remember it every day," Zachary assured her. He leaned in and kissed her softly. "I also remember that I am the luckiest man alive, because I get to spend every day beside the strongest, smartest, most beautiful woman in Arizona." "You are just saying that because you want me to agree to buy those new horses you have been eyeing," Rebecca said, but she was smiling. "I am saying it because it is true," Zachary said. "The horses are just a bonus." Their children came tumbling out of the house then, Thomas at 11 already showing signs of becoming as tall as his father, Sarah at 9 all fire and determination, and little James at 7 still trying to keep up with his older siblings. They swarmed around their parents, full of stories about their day and plans for tomorrow, and Rebecca looked at her family and felt profound gratitude for everything she had. She had started as a young woman alone and afraid, discovering that someone she trusted had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She had found the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was terrifying, and in doing so had discovered her own strength. She had also found love with a man who saw her as an equal partner, who respected her intelligence and valued her contributions, who built a life with her based on trust and mutual support. The Double E Ranch thrived not just because of good business practices or favorable market conditions, but because it was built on a foundation of honesty and hard work. Rebecca and Zachary taught their children those values, showing them by example what it meant to do the right thing even when it was difficult, to stand up for what you believed in, to treat people fairly and expect the same in return. As the years passed and their children grew into capable adults, Rebecca sometimes thought about how different her life might have been if she had never discovered Marcus's theft. If she had just continued on, unaware and trusting, slowly losing everything her father had built while Marcus lined his pockets. The thought made her shudder, but it also made her appreciate what she had all the more. Marcus's betrayal had been painful, but it had also been transformative. It had forced her to become the person she was always meant to be, strong and independent, and capable of protecting what was hers. And it had brought Zachary into her life, this wonderful man who had stood beside her through everything, who had helped her fire the corrupt Foreman and recover from the damage he had done, who had loved her through all the challenges and celebrated all the victories. In the end, Rebecca thought, that was the real story. Not the theft or the confrontation or even the recovery of the stolen money. The real story was about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose to build something beautiful together, who faced their challenges with courage and came out stronger on the other side. On a warm evening in the summer of 1898, as Rebecca sat on the porch of her ranch house surrounded by her family, watching the sun set over the land her father had loved and she had fought to protect, she felt a deep sense of peace. The ranch was prosperous, her children were healthy and happy, and the man she loved sat beside her holding her hand just as he had done for 15 years. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked, seeing the reflective look on her face. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Rebecca said. "For everything. For my father's legacy, for this land, for our family, and most of all for you. For that day you rode into Florence with Marcus, for your willingness to help a stranger, for your courage and your love and your partnership. You changed my life, Zachary Quinn." "We changed each other's lives," Zachary corrected gently. "I was just a drifter before I met you, Rebecca. You gave me a home, a purpose, a family. You showed me what it means to fight for something that matters, to build something lasting. I am the one who should be grateful." "Then we will both be grateful," Rebecca said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky and their children's laughter echoed from inside the house, Rebecca closed her eyes and smiled. She had discovered her foreman's betrayal, had found the strength to confront him, and had recovered not just the stolen money but something far more valuable. She had discovered her own courage, had found true love, and had built a life and a legacy that would endure for generations. The Double E Ranch stood as a testament to what could be accomplished through honesty, hard work, and the courage to face difficult truths. But more than that, it stood as a testament to love, to partnership, to the idea that two people working together could overcome any obstacle and build something beautiful. Rebecca and Zachary raised their children with those values, and when Thomas eventually took over management of the ranch, he did so with the same integrity and commitment that his parents had demonstrated. Sarah married a neighboring rancher and helped expand the family's holdings, while James became a lawyer in Phoenix, using his skills to help protect ranchers from the kind of fraud and corruption that had once threatened his mother's legacy. As Rebecca and Zachary grew older, They remained as devoted to each other as they had been in those early days. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, remembering the journey that had brought them together. The theft, the confrontation, the cattle drive to Casa Grande, those first tentative moments of falling in love, the building of a life and a family. You ever regret any of it? Rebecca asked Zachary one evening when they were both well into their 60s and their grandchildren were playing in the yard. Not for a single moment, Zachary said firmly. Every challenge, every difficulty, every moment of fear or uncertainty, it all led us here. How could I regret anything that gave me this life with you? I feel the same way, Rebecca said. Even Marcus's betrayal, as painful as it was, brought us together. It taught me who I really was, what I was capable of, and it brought you into my life. I have always believed that things happen for a reason, Zachary said. Not that bad things are good, but that we can choose to find good in how we respond to them. You could have given up when you discovered what Marcus had done. You could have just sold the ranch and walked away, but you did not. You fought, and that fight revealed the amazing woman you are. Rebecca squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his touch, the strength that had never faltered in all their years together. We fought together, she corrected. From the moment you agreed to help me, we have been partners in everything. That is what I am most proud of, Zachary, not the ranch or the money or any of the material success. I am proud that we built a marriage based on equality and respect, that we raised our children to value integrity above all else, that we created something lasting and good. As the sun set on another day at the Double E Ranch, Rebecca and Zachary sat together in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. They had faced betrayal and overcome it, had built a life from the ashes of that discovery, and had created a legacy that would outlast them both. The story of how Rebecca Everett discovered her foreman had been stealing for years, how a cowboy named Zachary Quinn helped her fire him and recover, became part of the ranch's legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren as an example of courage and integrity. But for Rebecca and Zachary, it was simply the beginning of their love story, the moment when two souls found each other and chose to build something beautiful together. And that, in the end, was the greatest triumph of all. Not the recovery of stolen money or the bringing of a thief to justice, but the discovery that from betrayal and loss could come love and partnership, and a life richer than anything Rebecca had ever imagined possible. The Double E Ranch stood strong, a symbol of what could be built when people chose honesty over corruption, courage over fear, and love over all obstacles. And at its heart were two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and had chosen, every day, to build their future together.